The rain had come without warning, slicing across the Manhattan skyline like a blade dragged through silk. Thunder echoed over the scaffolding and steel that formed the bare bones of the Central Arts and Culture Pavilion, New York's most ambitious public project in over 2 decades. It was a building meant to defy time, a cathedral of modern design nestled between history and ambition. For Juliet Marlowe, it was more than architecture. It was her legacy. She stood beneath the overhang of a temporary shelter, the tailored shoulders of her navy blue blazer soaked, water dripping from her dark curls onto her collar. Around her, a cluster of men argued under umbrellas too small for their egos. They waved revised blueprints like surrender flags. "This isn't just a minor adjustment," Juliet said sharply, her voice slicing through the wind and static of the storm. Rotating the upper support beams by 5 degrees compromised not only the structural flow but the entire visual harmony. It changes how the atrium breathes. The site manager, a man who had once mistaken her for an intern, avoided. Her eyes, the specs were updated with the client's approval. Mr. Ashford signed off personally. Juliet's jaw tightened. Of course he had. Then unapprove them, she said coldly, retrieving her digital tablet with a trembling hand. Rain splashed across the screen as she pulled up the original renderings. These lines? These shadow angles. They were calculated to draw natural light down the central gallery like a river at dawn. This isn't decoration. It's the soul of the building. They didn't understand. They rarely did. She was 34, a black woman in an industry that praised innovation but rarely trusted it when it came in heels and conviction. She had fought tooth and nail for this project, had sketched the first concepts on a napkin at 2 a.m. in her Brooklyn apartment after waking from a dream. It had won awards before it was even built. The city had championed it. And now the very man who had once called it revolutionary was dismantling it with the casual precision of a man used to having final say. Juliet didn't have time to steel herself before she heard it. The murmur in the crowd, the shift in posture, the unconscious parting of people around a singular presence. Dominic Ashford had arrived. He came without an umbrella, rainwater darkening his tailored grey suit until it clung to him like a second skin. He moved with unhurried confidence, the kind earned not through charm or charisma, but through decades of being right, or at least never being told he was wrong. At 38, Dominic was one of the youngest managing partners at Ashford & Holt, a firm known as much for its courtroom victories as its ruthless discretion. He didn't glance at the chaos around him. His gaze found Juliet instantly. "Ms. Marlowe," he said with a nod, "we have some technical conflicts regarding structural tolerances. I thought it best to clarify in person." Her blood turned to ice. "You mean sabotage?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face before it was extinguished by professionalism. "Let's walk through it together. I'd like to hear your perspective." She didn't want to. Every bone in her body resisted. But she was not a woman who walked away from a fight, especially not one where the stakes were the dream she'd spent 5 years breathing into life. They moved through the skeletal building, in silence at first, stepping over puddles and avoiding sharp rebar. Inside, her voice came alive. She pointed to the cross beams, explained the way morning sunlight would refract through sandblasted panels, casting a pattern onto the mosaic floor she had designed to mirror constellations seen from Harlem in the 1930s. "This isn't just a building, Dominic," she said, exasperated. "It's history reframed through light. It's identity woven into space. Your changes erase that." To her surprise, he didn't argue. He listened, truly listened. For 40 minutes, they walked the exposed interior, with Juliet articulating her vision and Dominic asking thoughtful, occasionally brilliant questions about flow, acoustic design, community access. When she described the open staircase as a ribbon of movement connecting people from all walks of life, he murmured, like a helix of belonging. She looked at him then, not as an adversary, but as something more complicated. "You understood that before, when we pitched this together." He didn't respond right away. Rain whispered against the steel and stone around them. "I lost sight," he admitted, "not of the design, of the woman who made it matter." Juliet turned from him, unsure whether the burn behind her eyes was fury or grief. She had trusted him once, not just professionally but personally. He had become her sounding board, her late-night confidant, her partner in vision, and briefly, her lover. But that had been before. Before power plays, before silence replaced intimacy, Before betrayal came wrapped in legal jargon. Outside the building, the rain had softened. Dominic pulled out his phone. "Give me your direct line," he said. "Why?" "Because you were right. The changes don't align with your contract or with the spirit of the project. You'll receive new instructions by morning. Full reversion to your original specs. No compromises." She narrowed her eyes. "Just like that?" Dominic smiled faintly. "Baxter Development hired me because I win. This time, I'm choosing to win on the right side." Juliet stared at him. Her heart ached with memory. How easily he used to make her believe in magic and logic at once. But belief had a cost, and her tab was still unpaid. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But tell me, Dominic, why fight for it now? Why fight for me now?" He looked up at the half-finished beams, rainwater cascading like tears down the framework. "Because I've spent 15 years defending power," he said. "Maybe it's time I protect something beautiful instead." It would have been easier if he had been cruel, if he had argued, if he had stayed the man who signed the order to change her design without blinking. But this version of Dominic, wet, human, quietly repentant, was far more dangerous. 3 weeks later, he showed up at her studio unannounced. The city approved. "Additional funding," he said, eyes scanning the models and fabric samples littered across her workspace. "For the original materials." Her fingers paused on a drawing. "The request's been stalled for months. They needed legal clarification. I provided it." She blinked. "You stood before the commission for me?" "I stood for the building," he replied. "And maybe a little for the woman who taught me what a building could mean." Juliet should have said no when he asked her to dinner. Should have drawn a hard line. But instead she found herself seated across from him at a quiet table by the Hudson, remembering how his laughter used to loosen something locked inside her. They talked for hours. About art, about loss, about ambition, about how love doesn't survive in sterile rooms and silent compromises. And when he walked her to her door, she didn't pull away when he touched her cheek. "I never stopped believing in what we built," he whispered. "You mean the building?" she asked. "I mean everything. It would take more than words to rebuild what was shattered." But as Juliet watched him disappear into the misty night, a small part of her wondered. Could a foundation, once cracked, ever hold again if it was poured with truth this time? She didn't have the answer. But for the first time in months, she found herself sketching something new. Not a structure, not a floor plan. Juliet hadn't meant to let Dominic back into her life. She had built too many walls, buried too many truths. But as weeks unfolded into months, his presence returned like autumn creeping into the edges of a stubborn summer, gradually, gently, and without apology. At first, it was the project that tied them. They met in early morning walkthroughs, shared coffee over electrical schematics, argued about acoustic panels and community feedback forums. Their disagreements had softened, not because their fire had faded, but because somewhere in the silence between battle and surrender, respect had returned. Juliet couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened when he stood too close, or how her voice softened in those rare moments when he smiled. Not the sharp, performative grin he wore in boardrooms, but the unguarded one that surfaced only in quiet moments, like when she caught him watching a group of children sketching their dream buildings on the sidewalk outside the pavilion. "You ever think about what we were trying to build back then?" he asked one evening, as they leaned against the railing overlooking the East River. The sky blushed orange behind the Brooklyn Bridge. She didn't look at him. "You mean the project?" "I mean us." Juliet felt the shift, the way the air thickened with unspoken memories. "We built something without a blueprint. No wonder it collapsed. But we're architects, Juliet. We revise, reinforce, try again." She met his gaze then, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "You really think we can retrofit the past?" "No," he said, "but I think we can build forward." And yet, as much as her heart wanted to believe, her mind remembered. It remembered every moment she stood alone in meetings where Dominic should have been. Every late night she spent fielding questions while he avoided them. The silence after their last argument, the way he disappeared just when she needed someone to hold the weight with her. So when he asked her to join him for a weekend retreat in Charleston, a celebration for the pavilion's fundraising milestone, she hesitated. "I can't just pretend it's all simple," she said. "I'm not asking for simple," Dominic replied. "Just honesty. Charleston greeted them with warm breezes and the scent of salt water carried in from the coast. The retreat was held at a restored plantation turned heritage center, chosen for its architectural beauty and controversial history. Juliet walked the grounds with reverence and discomfort, her fingers tracing the grooves of names etched into stone, lives enslaved and forgotten until memory was forced to remember. "This place is a paradox," she said quietly as they stood beneath an oak tree older than both of their family lines combined. Dominic nodded. Like most things that matter, the weekend unfolded with lectures, art showcases, panels about architecture's role in social justice. Juliet was in her element, eloquent, incisive, fierce. Dominic watched her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper. Regret, maybe, or awe. One evening, as twilight melted into a humid night, he found her on the balcony of the guest house, barefoot, sipping sweet tea she didn't actually like. "I keep thinking about that boy today," she said, not turning to face him. "The one who asked why the windows were barred in the old quarters." I wanted to tell him the truth, but his mother shook her head. Said he wasn't ready. "And you?" Dominic asked gently. "Are you ready?" "For the truth?" She exhaled. "I don't know. Some of it hurts too much." He stepped beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "I hurt you, Juliet, not just with the building or the firm. I let ambition speak louder than loyalty. I didn't protect what we were building together." The truth hung in the air, raw and trembling. "I loved you," she whispered. "I loved you too," he said, "but I was too weak to say it when it mattered. It would have been easier to walk away, to cling to the pain because it was familiar." But Juliet had grown tired of bitterness, tired of carrying shame and silence like battle armor. So she told him everything. About the night she found out he had endorsed a private redesign behind her back. About the time she sat in her apartment for hours waiting for a call that never came. About the day she heard him laugh with another woman on speakerphone while assuring her he was too busy to meet. She laid it all bare. Her fury, her grief, the way her trust had fractured in places she hadn't even known existed. And Dominic, to his credit, didn't defend himself. He didn't excuse or deflect. He just listened. "I failed you," he said at last, his voice thick. "I thought winning meant staying ahead. But I was running away from feeling, from connection, from everything that made me vulnerable." "You hurt me," Juliet said. "But I let myself become invisible to you. I thought if I was perfect, you'd see me. But I shouldn't have had to earn what you promised freely." The silence between them was not empty. It was full of reckoning, of memory, of something new trying to grow where wounds still lived. They didn't kiss that night, didn't reach for the comfort of bodies to mask the ache of truth. Instead, they sat in the dark, side by side, watching the stars emerge over Charleston like pinpricks of hope. The next morning, before sunrise, Dominic found her in the garden, sketching. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "A bridge," she replied. He leaned in. "Between?" She looked at him, eyes clear. "Between where we were and where we could be. But it needs both sides anchored." "I'm ready," he said. "For the bridge?" "For the work, the rebuilding, the honesty." Juliet studied him. Not the tailored suit or the polished smile, but the man beneath, the boy who had once been afraid to love too loudly, the lawyer who had learned to win by losing parts of himself. "I'm not a blueprint you get to revise," she said gently. "I'm a whole structure, flawed and standing." "I don't want to change you," he said. "I want to stand beside you." In that moment, she believed him. Maybe it was the dawn, or maybe it was something deeper, something called back. By courage, not nostalgia. She reached for his hand, not as a symbol, but as a step. They would not be what they were. They would be something new, stronger, honest, and entirely their own. Juliet returned to New York with a heart both lighter and heavier. The Charleston trip had peeled back layers she had long ago buried. Truths laid bare between her and Dominic beneath starlit skies and Spanish moss. Yet what followed wasn't a magical shift into certainty. Healing, she realized, was never a straight path. It curved through valleys of doubt, climbed steep cliffs of memory, and demanded effort every single day. Their professional collaboration grew more fluid, marked by respect and shared vision. The cultural pavilion, once a battlefield of egos and betrayal, was slowly transforming into a beacon of reconciliation. But beyond blueprints and proposals, Juliet found herself grappling with a more intimate rebuilding, one that involved trust, identity, and what it meant to risk her heart again. Her friends noticed the change first. "You're softer," Claudia said one evening over dinner in Soho. "Still steel underneath, but the edges aren't slicing everyone open anymore." Juliet laughed, though her cheeks colored. "Maybe I'm just tired of fighting battles that don't need to be fought." Claudia raised an eyebrow. "Including Dominic," Juliet paused. "Especially him. But it's not about surrendering. It's about choosing when to build and when to break. I'm learning." Her weekends, once filled with distractions and social noise, now centered more around quiet reflection. Sometimes Dominic would join her at the botanical gardens in the Bronx, where they'd walk among wildflowers and talk about anything but the past. Books, food, politics, the evolution of neighborhoods. Other times, she kept the space for herself, savoring solitude not as loneliness, but as a reaffirmation of her own presence in the world. Yet even in this phase of reawakening, the shadows of yesterday lingered. Juliet still flinched when Dominic arrived late to a dinner they'd planned. Her mind, despite her best efforts, whispered that he was prioritizing something or someone else. She caught herself scrutinizing his phone glances, the tone of his messages, the words he didn't say. And Dominic, though patient, sometimes faltered. He bristled when she questioned his motives, grew quiet when she hesitated to let him fully into her space. They were two people rediscovering each other through the ruins of what had been, and it wasn't always graceful. Then came the night of the gala. It was a black tie fundraiser hosted by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, an event neither of them could skip given their partnership on the pavilion and its growing prestige. Juliet wore a sapphire silk gown that caught the light like water. Dominic, in a tailored navy tuxedo, looked every bit the polished magnate the press loved to write about. But behind the poise, tension simmered. The evening began with polite mingling and media appearances. They posed for photos, smiled for donors, gave practiced answers about art, architecture, and the city's cultural future. Yet beneath the surface, the emotional undercurrent was rising. Juliet had overheard a conversation earlier. Dominic speaking with a former colleague, Luciana, with whom he had a rumored history. Nothing was explicitly said, but the familiarity in their laughter, the lingering touch on his arm, brought back a rush of doubt that Juliet thought she had tamed. By the time Dominic returned to her side, she had withdrawn behind a mask of elegance and ice. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Perfect," she replied, too sharply. He studied her for a moment. "You don't do passive-aggressive well. Just say what's on your mind." Juliet's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Are you still hiding things from me, Dominic?" His expression shifted. "Is this about Luciana?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "There's nothing going on," he said quietly. "There hasn't been for years." "But there was," she replied. "And you didn't mention her, not once." "Because it didn't matter. To you." They left the gala early, not in anger, but in a silence that screamed of distance. Back, in Juliet's apartment, the confrontation broke. "I know it's not fair," she said, tears threatening. "I know I can't punish you forever for things you've already owned. But when I see you with someone like her, it's like I'm watching a rerun of the woman I used to be. Silent, unsure, waiting for proof I was enough." Dominic didn't try to justify. He crossed the room slowly, gently taking her hands. "You are not that woman anymore," he said. "And I am not the man who hurt her. But I understand if you need more time to believe that." She looked up, at him, voice shaking. "And if I never believe it, I'll keep showing you," he replied. "Until you do, or until you ask me to stop." She didn't answer with words, just leaned into him, letting her walls bend, if not fall. That night, they didn't make love. They simply lay together, his arms around her, her breathing slow against his chest, as if their very stillness was an act of healing. In the days that followed, something shifted. Juliet began attending therapy, not just for closure, but for clarity. She wanted to know who she was without Dominic, without the baggage of their history. She wanted to be whole by her own design. Dominic, for his part, began opening up about his past, not just the mistakes he made with her, but the pressures of growing up under a legacy of power, the expectations that shaped him into someone afraid to fail, even in love. They shared journals. They took long drives to upstate New York, where silence stretched between them like an open field, ripe for planting new stories. They argued sometimes, about furniture, about politics, about whose turn it was to pick. The playlist, but always returned to each other with a kind of gentleness neither had known before. Love, Juliet realized, wasn't just the high of reconciliation. It was also the daily decision to keep choosing each other, even when old wounds whispered and fears knocked at the door. One morning, as sunlight spilled into her kitchen and Dominic made her coffee exactly the way she liked, 1 sugar, oat, milk, no stirring, she watched him with quiet awe. "We've come far," she said softly. He met her eyes. "And we still have far to go." "Are you scared?" "Terrified," he admitted. "But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe." "Without you," she smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had finally stopped pretending it had to be. And in that truth there was freedom, and love, real love, began to bloom. Juliet stood at the edge of the cliff in Big Sur, the Pacific roaring beneath her like a memory she couldn't outrun. The wind whipped her hair, salty and wild, while Dominic stayed back, giving her the space she hadn't needed to ask for. They were here on impulse. Her idea, surprisingly, after a particularly honest night where she admitted she was tired. Of the city, tired of the questions, tired of constantly managing her feelings like a CEO manages risk. "I want to breathe," she had told him. Dominic didn't question it. He booked the house, arranged the trip, and left everything behind for a few days. But here, in the solitude of California's rugged coastline, what Juliet found wasn't just breath. It was confrontation. With herself. With the pieces of her soul she hadn't touched since before the betrayal. With the version of her that existed before she ever knew what it meant to be broken by love. Their days passed in stillness. They hiked, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter. At night they sat by the fire, sipping wine, sharing stories not about what they were building together now, but about who they had been before they ever met. Juliet told him about her father, an artist who had taught her to see the world, in texture and color, but who had also vanished when she needed him most. Dominic spoke of his mother, the woman who had raised him with so much steel that he didn't know how to be soft until it was too late. It was during one of these nights, while watching the embers crackle, that Juliet turned to him and asked, "Why didn't you just tell me the truth back then?" Dominic didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "Because I was a coward. I thought I could control everything, my image, our partnership, even your heart. I didn't trust love to be enough. I didn't trust myself not to ruin it." She nodded, not with agreement, but with understanding. "And now? Now I know I'd rather risk losing everything with the truth than keep anything with a lie." The words lingered between them. Not a promise, not a plea, just truth. Juliet leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the man beside her was no longer the man who had broken her. Maybe he was someone trying to become more. For her. For himself. But returning to New York after that was like stepping into a storm they thought they had outrun. The city didn't care about healing. It demanded headlines. It wanted statements, stories, proof. The cultural pavilion was making waves, and with it came scrutiny. Investors wanted updates. Journalists wanted angles. The past Dominic and Juliet had worked so hard to move through was now being served up in curated gossip columns and whispered boardroom conversations. Are they really back together? One article asked. Or is it all a convenient rebranding for the public eye? Juliet tried to ignore it, but the whispers found her anyway. At a gallery opening, a woman in a red dress approached her with a smile too tight to be real. "You're very brave," she said, wine glass in hand. "Not every woman could forgive what he did." Juliet met her gaze. "And not every woman needs your opinion on her choices." The woman blinked. "I just meant, I know exactly what you meant." She walked away, her heart pounding, not from shame, but from the weight of constantly having to justify her healing. Later that night, in the quiet of her apartment, she told Dominic about the encounter. He was quiet, then reached for her hand. "You don't have to defend me to anyone, especially not women who thrive on other people's pain." "But I'm not defending you," she said. "I'm defending my right to grow, my right to decide who I am and who I love without the world labeling me weak for it." Dominic cupped her face, his voice rough. "Then let me carry that with you." In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened, not in grand gestures but in small, steady rituals. He left notes in her briefcase. She made him playlists for his early morning jogs. They fought sometimes, about deadlines, about the future, about what compromise looked like. But they always circled back to the truth. They wanted each other not just as lovers but as equals. Then came an unexpected twist. Juliet was offered a position to lead a major art initiative in Paris. It was a dream she had once shelved, thinking it incompatible with the life she was rebuilding in New York. But the offer was real, the opportunity enormous, and the timing cruel. "What if this is the thing I was meant to do?" she asked Dominic one night. "Then you should do it." "And us?" "I won't stand in the way of your dreams again," he said, voice steady. "Even if it breaks me." She looked at him, searching for resentment, fear, ego, but found only love. "You'd let me go?" "I'd wait for you," he said, "even if I had no idea how long." Juliet cried then, not because she was sad, but because she had never felt so deeply seen. The next day she turned the offer down, not because she was afraid to go, but because she realized that what she was building in New York, with Dominic, with herself, was no less meaningful than anything across the ocean. She didn't need Paris to prove her worth. She needed roots, and she had finally begun to grow them again. Their next months were filled with movement, finishing the pavilion, launching new projects, re-establishing trust in places long abandoned. But beneath the busy pace was a quieter transformation. Juliet was no longer a woman merely surviving the storm. She was steering through it, eyes open, hands steady, heart healing. And Dominic, he was no longer just a man trying to make amends. He was becoming the kind of partner who knew that love wasn't about fixing the past. It was about choosing again and again to show up for the present. Together, they were no fairy tale. They were flawed, complicated, beautifully human, but they were real. And in a world so obsessed with perfection, maybe that was the most romantic story of all. Juliet stood in the heart of the nearly completed cultural pavilion, sunlight slicing through the glass ceiling like hope through darkness. It had been months since construction began, but standing there now, watching the interplay of architecture and purpose, she realized this wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of what they had lost, of what they were daring to rebuild. The Asahi gallery walls gleamed with anticipation. Each room was curated not just with art, but with stories, pieces that spoke of diaspora, resilience, longing. This had been her vision. A space that didn't just showcase beauty, but challenged narratives, invited healing. And Dominic had believed in that vision from the beginning, long before either of them had found the courage to believe in each other. Again. Still, as launch day neared, Juliet felt the weight return, the kind of pressure that clings to your ribs at night and doesn't let go. Not from fear of failure, but from the fear that even success wouldn't erase the shadows of betrayal. That no matter how far she'd come, the world might always see her through the prism of his past mistake. Dominic, sensing her unease, offered no lectures, no grand reassurances. Instead, he showed up. Every morning with coffee, every evening with questions about the artists she'd featured, every hour in between with support so steady it humbled her. "You really believe this matters?" she asked one night as they stood in the atrium gazing at the sculpture installation that would be the centerpiece. "I believe you matter," he said. "And anything you pour your soul into, this place, these walls, your vision, deserves the world's attention." She wanted to believe that was enough. But part of her still struggled with the idea that a second chance didn't have to mean living under constant scrutiny. That tension bled into other parts of their life. One evening, over dinner at their loft, the conversation drifted from project timelines to personal ones. "Have you thought about the future?" Dominic asked gently. "I mean, past the pavilion." Juliet hesitated. "In what way?" "In every way. Us, home, family, where we're going after this." She put her fork down, appetite gone. "I haven't let myself think that far." "Why not?" "Because when I did before, it all crumbled." He reached for her hand. "And what if it doesn't this time?" "I'm not ready to risk it," she whispered. He didn't push. He simply nodded, as if understanding that love meant holding space, not always filling it. But the question lingered. What did come next? For all their progress, for all the quiet victories, Juliet still felt like she was living in a provisional space, half in the past, half in possibility. Then came the gala. It was the final test, a formal unveiling of the pavilion, attended by donors, media, artists, and dignitaries. Everything they had worked for would be on display. Not just the physical space, but the story behind it. Their story. Juliet wore a gown the color of midnight, her hair swept back, eyes lined with resolve. Dominic, beside her in classic black tux, looked at her not as a possession, but as a privilege. The room shimmered with potential. But all Juliet felt was exposed. This was no longer just about art or philanthropy. It was about whether she could stand, fully visible and not flinch. As she took the stage to deliver her speech, the murmurs quieted. She looked out at the crowd, some familiar, some not. And then she spoke. Not from notes, not from a script, but from the marrow of her truth. This pavilion was never about perfection, she began. It was born from imperfection, from broken pieces, of culture, of relationships, of dreams, and the belief that beauty could still be made from them. Her voice didn't tremble. It soared. We live in a world that loves comeback stories, but we rarely talk about what it costs to come back. The shame, the self-doubt, the loneliness. But we also don't talk enough about grace, about choosing to forgive, not just others but ourselves. She glanced at Dominic, their eyes locked, and in that moment she wasn't performing. She was reclaiming. I stand here today not because I have all the answers, but because I've stopped needing them to move forward. I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I know this. Healing isn't a finish line. It's a choice, every single day. Applause erupted, but all she heard was her heartbeat. She had said it. She had lived it. She was free. That night, in the quiet after the gala, Dominic approached her on the rooftop of the pavilion, where the city stretched beneath them like a promise. "I've never loved you more," he said. Juliet turned to him, eyes soft. "Even when I doubted everything? Especially then, because you were still showing up, still choosing to hope." She leaned into him, the weight of years melting against his chest. "I'm scared." "So am I," he whispered. "But maybe that's what makes it real." Their kiss wasn't a grand ending. It was a beginning, a decision. To keep showing up, to keep choosing. As dawn painted the skyline in gold, they stood side by side, not as perfect people, but as two hearts willing to rebuild. Again, and again, and again. Juliet woke to a room filled with golden morning light, the kind that poured through the tall windows of their newly renovated brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. The softness of the sheets contrasted with the tension still curled around her chest. Despite the success of the gala, despite the newfound calm in her relationship with Dominic, something remained unsettled. Growth didn't always feel triumphant. It often felt like mourning the person you once were. Dominic was already up. She heard him downstairs, the muffled clinks of dishes, the quiet baritone of his voice as he took a call. He was running global operations again, no longer from skyscrapers in Midtown, but from a small sunlit home office overlooking the East River. He had shifted his empire's focus, redirecting resources into initiatives that supported the very communities he once overlooked. It wasn't redemption through charity, it was commitment through transformation. But Juliet's unease wasn't about Dominic. It was about her. Somewhere between reclaiming her voice and rebuilding their bond, she had stopped asking herself what she wanted next. The pavilion was complete. Her role as its founder had been acknowledged. The storm had passed and now came the quiet, and the quiet was terrifying. So she did what she hadn't done in a long time. She left. No warning, no itinerary, just a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I need space to breathe. I'll be back." She drove north away from the city through the winding roads of the Hudson Valley until she reached Cold Spring. It was a place they once visited when things were still fragile but full of hope. She rented a small cottage by the lake, tucked her phone into a drawer, and let the silence do what it must. In the stillness, Juliet began to write again. Not speeches, not fundraising appeals, but journal entries, letters never sent, stories of women clawing their way back to themselves. She spent her mornings walking through the woods, her afternoons sketching outlines for a memoir, and her nights listening to the soft lapping of the water. And yet Dominic never intruded. Not a single text. Not a single call. He had understood the assignment her silence gave him. To let her go far enough that she could find her way back. Not to him, but to herself. Weeks passed. Then, one rainy afternoon, Juliet drove into town and ducked into the bookstore to escape the downpour. As she browsed the shelves, she noticed a small table stacked with books about healing, transformation, and women's stories. Tucked in the middle was a book by a local therapist titled The Unfinished Self. Intrigued, she flipped it open and read a line that knocked the air from her lungs. We don't become ourselves by being certain. We become by enduring the mess of unknowing. It was the truth she had been circling but hadn't dared to name. That evening she emailed Dominic. Not a grand declaration, just still breathing, still discovering. Thank you for the space. He replied. Always. When Juliet returned to Brooklyn, it wasn't to fanfare or a romantic gesture. It was a quiet homecoming. Dominic met her at the door, took her overnight bag without a word, and pulled her into the softest, most patient embrace she'd ever known. Over dinner, she told him about the lake, the journal, the bookshop. He listened, asking questions not to direct her path but to understand it. I want to start a new project, she said. Something more personal. A foundation for women coming out of high-profile betrayals. Not just survivors, but leaders. Think tanks, storytelling initiatives, career programs. Dominic nodded. What do you need from me? She paused. Nothing. And everything. I need you not to lead it. I need you to believe in it. Fund it if you can. But let me own it. His smile was pure pride. Then it's yours. But not everything could be rebuilt on gratitude and mutual respect. One evening, over wine, the conversation turned more intimate. Do you ever wonder, Juliet asked, if what we have now is stronger, or just more cautious? Dominic looked at her for a long time. Both. I think we love wiser now, which makes it harder, but real. I miss reckless sometimes, she said with a half smile. So do I, he admitted. But I wouldn't trade this version of us. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his. Neither would I. But I want to find our fire again. They did. On a trip to Morocco, where the chaos of the souks and the hush of the Sahara cracked something. Open. They laughed louder, touched more often, argued about nothing and everything, and made love like they were running out of time. And when they returned, sun-kissed and windswept, Juliet began the groundwork for the foundation. She named it Rise, plus Radiate. Within months, it became a haven for women who had been shamed publicly, dismissed privately, and forced to start over. But with success came new scrutiny. One day, while Juliet was speaking at a conference, a journalist cornered her during a break. Do you ever worry that the authenticity of your mission is clouded by your relationship with Dominic Fordham? The reporter asked. That people see your comeback as tethered to his influence? Juliet didn't flinch. I didn't rise because of Dominic. I rose in spite of what we went through. And I shine because I chose not to stay in the dark. The story went viral. That night, as she sat beside Dominic on the rooftop, watching the city exhale, he turned to her with a quiet awe. You were born to do this, she leaned into him. And yet I wouldn't have found it without walking through. Hell first, together, he reminded her. No, she said softly. Alone. And then together. It was the distinction that mattered. Because love was not her salvation. It was her reward. And as they sat under the stars, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that scars could become symbols, Juliet finally exhaled the breath she hadn't known she was holding. She had made it. Not just back, but forward. The winter air in Brooklyn had shifted. Crisper, sharper, with the kind of chill that made even the most resilient city dwellers walk a little faster. Juliet stood outside the Rise Plus Radiate headquarters, the bold signage above the door gleaming in the low afternoon sun. Inside, dozens of women were sharing stories, attending workshops, dreaming new dreams. And yet, outside, Juliet felt a growing unease she hadn't yet voiced, not even to Dominic. It had been almost a year since she founded the organization, and success had come with speed she hadn't anticipated. Media features, speaking invitations, high-profile collaborations, it should have felt exhilarating. But to Juliet, it felt unbalanced, like the mission had started to pull her in directions that stretched too far from her initial truth. Dominic noticed it too. One evening, as they sat in their kitchen, sharing a quiet dinner after a long day, he asked, "When was the last time you wrote just for yourself?" She looked up, startled. "I don't know. Months, maybe." "Why?" "You used to write when you needed to breathe. Lately, it feels like you haven't exhaled in weeks." His words struck a chord. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd poured into being the face of Rise Plus Radiate instead of its heart. Her passion had turned into a performance. One she felt she couldn't step away from without disappointing the very people she wanted to empower. Juliet made a decision that night. She called an emergency board meeting and announced her temporary step back from the day-to-day operations. It was met with shock, concern, and even a bit of resistance. But she held firm. "I need to reconnect with why I started this," she said. "I need to stop speaking about healing and start living it again." And so, she left New York. This time, she didn't go to Cold Spring. She chose Charleston, South Carolina, a place she had never been, where the ocean air was thick, with salt and the streets whispered stories through their cobblestones. She rented a quiet cottage on Sullivan's Island, away from the buzz, away from the headlines, and she began to write. Not for the public, not for the cause, but for herself. She wrote about grief, about joy, about the quiet terror of success. She wrote about loving Dominic and learning not to lose herself in that love again. She wrote about the women who sat in her sessions, about the fire in their eyes and the silence in their bones. Meanwhile, Dominic stayed in Brooklyn. They spoke nightly, but there was space in their conversations now, an understanding that this part of her journey was hers alone. And yet something unexpected happened. Dominic began to unravel too. Without Juliet's steady presence, the stillness in their home grew louder. He realized how much of his own healing had been tethered to hers, how he had worked so hard to be her anchor that he had forgotten to anchor himself. He returned to therapy, reopened old wounds, revisited the night of his betrayal, not to wallow, but to understand. In a raw session with his therapist, he admitted, "I never forgave myself for what I did to her. I just moved forward, hoping love would cover the cracks." But forgiveness, the therapist replied, isn't just a bridge to her. It's a homecoming to yourself. Those words haunted Dominic. Back in Charleston, Juliet met someone who changed her perspective, a woman named Lena, a retired professor and poet who lived 2 doors down. They met during a beach walk when Lena noticed Juliet scribbling in a weather-worn journal. "You're writing to heal," Lena said without introduction. Juliet laughed softly. "Aren't we all?" Over tea and long conversations, Lena became a mirror Juliet hadn't realized she needed. "You've been running toward power," Lena said one night. "But the real revolution isn't in being louder. It's in being quieter and still being heard." Those words echoed inside her. Juliet returned to Brooklyn a month later. This time, she didn't announce her return. She simply showed up at Rice, Plus. Radiate one morning, coffee in hand, smile warm, but eyes steadier than ever. Her staff greeted her with surprise and relief. The foundation had survived her absence, thrived even, but it was different, more automated, less personal. She walked into her old office, sat down and stared out the window. Later that evening, she sat with Dominic by the fireplace, silence stretching between them until she said, "Do you think we've been loving each other safely?" He didn't answer right away. "I think we've been loving each other responsibly," he said. "Which is safe, but not the same as being fearless." She turned to face him. "I want fearless again." "So do I," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But it'll cost us. Comfort, control, predictability." Juliet leaned in. "Then let's pay the price." What followed wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, sacred. They tore down the rituals that had become performances. Mourning, check-ins, overly polite conversations, the habit of withholding discomfort to preserve peace. They began to ask harder questions, to challenge one another's silences, to admit when resentment crept in. They started therapy again, not as a last resort, but as an act of radical love. Juliet restructured her role at Rice Plus Radiate. She created a leadership council of former participants, relinquishing full control so the foundation could grow beyond her. She focused on mentorship, not management, on legacy, not ego. She and Dominic traveled, this time not to escape, but to discover. In Kyoto, they watched cherry blossoms fall like confetti and made a pact to let beauty interrupt their lives more often. In Iceland, they bathed in hot springs and spoke of dreams not yet dared. In Rome, they got lost in alleyways and kissed under broken arches. One night, in a small hotel room overlooking the Amalfi Coast, Juliet whispered, "What if this is the end of our beginning?" Dominic smiled. "Then it's the beginning of everything else." They didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but they stopped letting it narrate their story. They had rewritten themselves too many times to cling to any single draft. Back home, Juliet finished her memoir. She titled it Unbroken Quiet. It was part journal, part manifesto, part love letter to the self she almost lost. When the book launched, it resonated deeply. Not because it was polished, but because it was raw. Because it didn't promise a fairy tale. It promised truth. In one interview, a host asked, "What is the most important thing you've learned through all of this?" Juliet paused, then said, "That healing isn't a destination. It's a devotion. And love, when done right, doesn't rescue you. It reminds you of who you were before the world told you to disappear." The studio went quiet, and somewhere in a quiet brownstone in Brooklyn, Dominic watched the interview with tears in his eyes. He didn't just see the woman he loved. He saw the woman he'd nearly destroyed, reborn into someone even he couldn't have imagined. And for the first time, he didn't feel guilt. He felt, oh, autumn returned to Brooklyn with its usual understated charm. Crimson leaves, brisk breezes, and an air that promised change. For Juliet and Dominic, it marked the quiet passage of another year. A year no longer defined by chaos or rebuilding, but by rediscovery. Their days had found a rhythm that neither of them rushed nor resisted. Morning walks through Prospect Park. Evenings filled with open windows and jazz humming softly in the background. There was peace. But there was also something else. A question neither had voiced aloud, hovering like the last ember of a once consuming fire. What now? It was Juliet who first felt it, that familiar tug of restlessness. She had poured her story into unbroken quiet, toured the country sharing her journey, and watched Rise Plus radiate flourish under new leadership. Her heart had been both emptied and filled, but as the spotlight dimmed and the applause faded, she found herself staring at her reflection one evening, wondering, is this the final version of me? She brought it up to Dominic over dinner. They were having butternut squash risotto, his specialty, candles flickering between them. "I think I want to go back to school," she said. He paused, fork midair. "School? I want to study psychology, real clinical academic work, not just workshops and stories. I want to understand the architecture of pain, the anatomy of healing." Dominic blinked, then nodded slowly. "Then do it." "You're not surprised?" "I'm never surprised when you become more of yourself." And so at 42, Juliet enrolled in a master's program in clinical psychology. It was humbling, being surrounded by 20-somethings armed with textbooks and theories. But she wasn't there to impress. She was there to learn. Meanwhile, Dominic returned to architecture with a renewed sense of purpose. He left the firm that had tolerated his past rather than embraced his growth. With 2 former colleagues, he launched a boutique agency focused on restorative design, spaces that weren't just beautiful but healing. Hospitals that felt like sanctuaries, shelters that looked like homes. Their relationship evolved again. With new demands on their time, they had to relearn presence. It was no longer about proximity, but about attention, about choosing each other in small ways. Texts in the middle of a busy day, kisses on foreheads before sunrise, long conversations in bed about dreams too fragile to speak aloud during daylight. But then came the letter. It arrived on a Monday morning, handwritten, no return address. Juliet recognized the handwriting immediately. Eleanor, her mother. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Juliet walked away from the toxic cycles and manipulations. The letter was 3 pages long, apologetic, tentative, raw. Eleanor spoke of therapy, of regrets, of watching Juliet on television and crying, not out of jealousy but shame. "I see now what I cost you," the letter read, "and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it. For once, I needed to say the truth." Juliet stared at the pages for hours, not with anger, not even pain, but with the aching ache of recognition, of realizing that sometimes healing means opening doors you once locked to survive. She brought it up to Dominic that night. "I think I want to see her." He didn't flinch. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No, not this time. I need to go alone." And so she did. She met Eleanor in a small cafe in Boston. The woman who once wielded words like knives now looked smaller, softer, but not pitiful, just human. They didn't cry. They talked, really talked, about the years they lost, about the damage done, about the fact that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It means freedom. "I don't know if we can ever be mother and daughter again," Juliet said, voice trembling. "Maybe we don't have to be," Eleanor replied. Maybe we can just be two women who stop pretending they didn't survive each other. Juliet didn't stay long, but as she left, Eleanor reached out and touched her hand, not to hold it, but to feel it, to believe she was real. Back in Brooklyn, Dominic waited with tea and quiet eyes. Juliet sank into his arms and whispered, "I didn't forgive her to let her in. I forgave her to let myself out." Later that month, Dominic faced his own ghost. He was invited to speak at an alumni event at MIT, and part of the panel included someone he never expected to see again. Brandon Klein, the colleague who once reported his affair, igniting the scandal that nearly ended everything. Brandon approached him after the event, awkward but sincere. "I was angry back then. Jealous, maybe. You had everything, brilliance, charisma, her. I didn't handle it right." Dominic, too, his own surprise, didn't feel rage. He felt sadness. For both of them. "We were both broken," he said. "But I've spent too long blaming others for wounds I never tried to heal." They shook hands, not as friends, but as men no longer at war with the past. Winter arrived, and with it a new kind of stillness. One night, while decorating their Christmas tree, Dominic pulled a small box from his pocket. Not velvet, not extravagant, just simple and quiet, like the life they had built. "I know we said we didn't need rings," he began, "but I don't want this to be about what we need. I want it to be about what we choose. Every day. Forever." Juliet opened the box. Inside was a silver band, etched with words in tiny script. "Even in silence, I choose you." She didn't cry. She smiled. And then she said yes. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Their wedding was small. Just close friends. No press, no performance. Just truth. As they stood under the winter sky, snow gently falling, they made vows not of perfection, but of promise. "I vow to fall in love with your evolution," Juliet said. "I vow to honor your light without dimming mine," Dominic replied. They didn't walk away from their past. They carried it, but not as a burden, as a reminder of how far they'd come. That night, as they lay in bed, married in every way that mattered, Juliet whispered, "Do you think we're finally healed?" Dominic took her hand. "No, but I think we finally stopped bleeding." And in the quiet that followed, they both exhaled, for the first time, without fear. In the stillness of the early morning, the city outside Juliet and Dominic's loft stirred gently to life. Horns in the distance, the hum of delivery trucks, the scent of roasted beans from the cafe downstairs. It was the kind of morning that held no grandeur, yet carried the sacred weight of everything they'd fought for. Juliet sat by the window, wrapped in a thick sweater, her journal open on her lap. Her fingers moved slowly across the page, writing, not for an audience, not even for herself, but as a practice of presence. Each word she penned was a reckoning, a release, and sometimes a revelation. Dominic emerged from their bedroom, hair tousled, coffee in hand. He stood behind her for a moment, watching her quietly. These were the mornings he cherished the most, the ones unspoken, where love was less about declarations and more about devotion in its purest, simplest form. She looked up and smiled. "You always know when I'm writing the ending." He came to sit beside her. "It's the way you furrow your brow," Juliet laughed. "I think I'm finally ready to close this chapter. Not our story, just the part that hurt the most. The past years had unfolded like chapters in a novel neither of them could have imagined. Heartbreak, betrayal, rebirth, redemption. But now their lives had shifted from surviving to thriving, from seeking to building. Juliet had just completed her first year of graduate school. Her professors were in awe, not just of her intellect, but of the unique lived experience she brought into every clinical case, every debate on trauma theory. She wasn't just learning. She was transforming everything she touched. She was working part-time at the Women's Trauma Center in Harlem, helping others find language for pain that had once silenced them. Her story had become a bridge for others. She was no longer defined by what happened to her, but by what she had done with it. Dominic, too, had found a rhythm that gave him meaning. His firm's designs were now featured in international journals. But more than that, he had created spaces that mattered, places where survivors could heal, where communities felt seen. He was finally doing the kind of work that reflected the man he had become. Yet, even as the surface of their lives gleamed with purpose and connection, there were quiet undercurrents, those inevitable moments where old wounds whispered instead of screamed. One evening, as they returned from a fundraiser event, Juliet seemed distant. She stared out of the car window, fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Dominic reached over, brushing his hand against hers. "You okay?" She nodded, but then after a beat said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't broken that night in Paris?" He didn't answer right away. "I think," he said finally, "we would have stayed together, but we wouldn't have become who we are now." She turned to look at him. "I don't regret what we lost," he continued, "but I'm grateful for what we fought to build." Juliet's eyes shimmered. "Me too. But sometimes the ghost of that version of me, so angry, so broken, still lingers." Dominic leaned in and kissed her hand. "You're allowed to visit your past. Just don't unpack there." Their conversations had become a sanctuary. They spoke of guilt and grace, of dreams still waiting, of fears that crept in at night. It was not always easy, but it was honest. And that honesty had become the heartbeat of their love. In the spring, Juliet was invited to speak at a conference on trauma resilience in San Francisco. Dominic came with her, not as a shadow or a security blanket, but as a quiet supporter in the crowd. She took the stage in front of hundreds, therapists, scholars, survivors. Her voice didn't tremble. Her story was no longer a wound. It was a map. "I used to think healing meant erasing the pain," she said. "But healing is not about forgetting. It's about remembering without reliving, about finding your breath again, even when your chest still aches." The audience rose to their feet, not for the woman who had once been broken, but for the one who stood whole. Afterward, as they walked through Golden Gate Park, Dominic pulled out a notebook. "What's that?" she asked, amused. "A design," he said, "for a healing center in Brooklyn, inspired by your talk." She paused. "Can I see?" He opened it. It was a structure filled with natural light, curved walls, meditation spaces, reading nooks. At the center was a garden open to the sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I want to build it for us," he said. "Not just you and me. Us. All the versions of us that got us here." They submitted the proposal together. A year later, it opened. The Haven. Juliet led workshops there, blending therapy with storytelling. Dominic hosted design students, teaching them how architecture could be empathetic, not just efficient. The center became a lighthouse for anyone navigating the dark. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they returned to Paris. The city that once shattered them now welcomed them like an old friend. They visited the bridge where they had their final fight. This time they stood hand in hand. "I remember thinking it was the end," Juliet said. "I remember thinking I didn't deserve a second chance," Dominic replied. They placed a lock on the railing, not as a symbol of perfection, but of perseverance. On it were engraved 3 words: "We return stronger." That night they made love under the Parisian sky, not as an apology, not as a promise, but as a celebration. Years would pass. Juliet would publish another book, not a memoir, but a novel inspired by the women she had worked with. Dominic's firm would expand to build community centers across underserved cities. They would face more trials, health scares, career setbacks, moments of doubt, but always they returned to each other. Always they chose. In the end, theirs was not a love story defined by wealth or scandal. It was defined by something far rarer. 2. Broken people who didn't save each other, but who chose to heal side by side. And in that choice, every single day, they rewrote what it meant to be whole. Juliet and Dominic's story is not one of fairy tale perfection, but of fierce honesty, painful growth, and the relentless pursuit of healing. From the glittering towers of Manhattan to the rain-soaked streets of Paris, their love was tested by betrayal, pride, and the weight of past trauma. Yet what makes their journey so unforgettable is not the wealth nor the heartbreak. It's the way they chose to fight for one another after the damage was done. Juliet, once broken and discarded, rose with a fire that neither time nor sorrow could extinguish. Her transformation from a wounded woman to a force of empathy and strength became the heart of this story. She learned not to wait for someone to rescue her, but to reclaim her voice, to find meaning in her pain, and ultimately to forgive not only Dominic but herself. Dominic, once the emblem of power and control, shattered under the truth of his own actions, but he didn't run from his shame. He learned that love was not control, not redemption, but presence. Through humility, vulnerability, and consistent effort, he slowly rebuilt trust brick by brick. His love wasn't loud. It became steady, unwavering, and ultimately transformative. Together, they created more than a relationship. They built a legacy, a center for healing, a marriage rooted in truth, and a shared life that honored every scar they carried. The lesson: this story teaches us that no matter how deep the wounds, healing is possible if we're willing to confront the truth, take responsibility, and love with intention. It reminds us that real strength is not about avoiding pain, but about facing it with courage and letting it shape us into better versions of ourselves. In our current world, where relationships are often rushed, where apologies are rarely paired with change, Juliet and Dominic's journey is a beacon. It tells us that healing is not linear. Love is not always perfect, but both are worth the work when two people are brave enough to grow through the mess together. If you've ever been hurt, betrayed, or lost in your own story, remember, your pain doesn't define you. What you do with that pain, that's where your power lives. And like Juliet, you have the right to rebuild, to rise, and to love again. Not because someone else completes you, but because you finally returned home to yourself. Interactive question. If you were in Juliet's shoes, what would you have done? A. Forgiven Dominic and rebuilt your relationship. B. Moved on and started a new life without him. Comment below with your answer. A or B. We want to hear from you. What did you think about Juliet and Dominic's story? Did it resonate with your own experiences or someone you know? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn and reflect with you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Your encouragement helps us continue creating powerful, emotionally rich stories just like this one. Let's keep growing together.